Good morning once again. I hope you have enjoyed the sunshine this week. I have been working on my shed. A lot of dry rot that was there before we bought the house, and so I've been trying to repair that. So I don't know, here in a week or so you might see some pictures in regards to if I made the project look worse or better. So we'll see, but I hope you are doing well. I want to let you know that here in the next probably the next few days, you're going to be getting some information in regards to what we're doing with our annual business meeting and our elections. I'll be getting some information that way, and I don't know about you, but this is driving me absolutely nuts. I think I said that last week and probably the week before that. It's going a little stir crazy. It's we as Christians are drawn together naturally, through the Holy Spirit, and here we are being asked to sacrifice and to not to do that for a little while, and it's an unnatural thing. So you probably feel it as well, but just to let you know, I've been praying for you. I miss you, and hopefully this thing settles down here in the next few weeks, and we can get back at it. So we'll see. Please open your Bibles to the book of Galatians chapter 4. We're going to be continuing our study here this week. We're in Galatians chapter 4, verse 21. Galatians 4, verse 21. And before we read it, I wanted to share a story with you. My dad told me this story, when I was younger, about how, I guess in the 80s, he was asked to go see a boxing match of a guy by the name of Mike Tyson. His friend had paid for through pay-per-view, and they were going to be able to watch the fight, and so his friend, invited all these people over so they could have snacks, hang out, enjoy the fight. And so my dad went, as well as all these other guys, to watch Mike Tyson fight. And his friend, just before the show, was like, I forgot something, and ran into the kitchen in order to get to the, the products and stuff and bring them out. And as many of you are aware, early on in Mike Tyson's career, Mike Tyson had a tendency of finishing fights in under a minute. And the friend in the kitchen was getting the stuff together to rush back, and by the time he got back, the fight was already over. He had spent all this money to get a pay-per-view fight, to see the fight, hang out with his friends, and it was over within a minute. Mike Tyson had a tendency of finishing people off incredibly quickly. It really powerful. He knew how to push opponents and knock them down. Well, I really get the sense that is what Paul is doing here in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. We've been studying, for the first few chapters where Paul has been making solid jabs against the opponents and their theological stance, and a few times he's caught them pretty hard. Then, a few weeks ago, there was a sort of a tone shift where Paul was telling him how perplexed he was and how he really felt for him. And he's like, you guys have shifted so far and you've become a different church than what I remember. And you almost get the sense that it's like this come and give me a hug moment. And so in boxing terms, they've been fighting for a little bit and now they wrap up to give themselves a breather. And here in Galatians 4, verse 21 through 31, it's like Paul has pushed them back and has wound up and is going to give them one more solid punch. He's going to finish this. He might not change their mind, but you cannot, after reading what Paul is about to say, come up with any other conclusion. Paul is very specific and very clear with what he's trying to communicate. That living, and so, now Paul in these verses here, okay? Paul in these verses, he makes use of allegory. Let's see. You know what? Forget it. Let's just read it and then I'll get into it, all right? So verse 21, he says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai, bearing children, is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Now you brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman." Now here in these verses you have 2 covenants mentioned, 2 different ladies mentioned, 2 children mentioned. You have multiple verses that stretch from Genesis to Isaiah quoted. You have reference of slavery and freedom, allegories, typologies, a lot of different things. So these verses, if we're not careful, can be incredibly confusing. And so as we get to this, and as we get to confusing passages here, there's something we've got to catch. Anytime we come across a confusing passage, and it's better to try to figure out, in order to figure out what a confusing passage is saying, try to go to either the first verse of it, the first sentence, or go to the end of it and see if he tries to wrap it up and summarize, and that's what he does. See, in Galatians chapter 5, he uses a word, the word therefore. And anytime you use the word therefore, it's good to ask, well, what is it there for? Why is this verse here? And so Paul, he's been building in the previous verses that we'll study here today, what he's been trying to say, with the result that they would not again live in slavery, but they would live freely. See, everything Paul says builds to this. And so while we're reading it, if you don't come to this conclusion by what he's saying, then you need to reread it and restudy it, because this is the conclusion that Paul is trying to get to. And so and then he says in verse 31 of chapter 4, he says, "So brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman." This is what Paul is trying to communicate. This is the big idea, okay? He is saying we are no longer slaves. Instead, Jesus has freed us. We are no longer in slavery to the law, but we are now living in freedom. And this is Paul's final punch and final huge statement of what this looks like from a theological standpoint. And he really drives it home today with some pictures that would have driven Jewish audiences or people who were thinking about going back into Judaism would have definitely been like, what? Is he allowed to say this? And this is what Paul does here, okay? So if you get nothing else from this sermon, get the fact that Jesus has freed us. We are no longer living in slavery. Now, All right, so let's build this up here, okay? So he says in verse 21, he says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law?" So it's a rhetorical question, but Paul is saying, hey, you guys keep saying that we're supposed to be under the law, under the system. Have you even actually studied the system? Do you even know what it says? And of course, their response would be like, well, of course we have. And what Paul is showing them, maybe you haven't quite understood it like you thought you understood it. So he creates this scenario, okay? So he explains something from a historical standpoint, and he says, "For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman." So one of these was one of the sons was Ishmael. He was born to the slave woman known as Hagar. And the other one was Isaac, and he was born to Sarah. And this is recorded in the book of Genesis. And then he says, "But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise." Now, keeping this all simple and quick. Abraham and Sarah had been promised by God that they would father a nation, father many nations, many people there. And, the Sarah wasn't able to have children. And so Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands, and what was a culturally accepted practice at that time, allow Abraham to be with another woman and able to have a child. And Abraham consented, they did the deed, and next thing you know, Ishmael is born. So they took things in their own power. See, God had promised them this, but they thought they needed to help things along, and so they did it in a way that God was like, that's not what I was intending. And then sometime later, about 14 years later, then Sarah was finally able to conceive. So one was done, as Paul has said, one was done according to the flesh. And that is trying to accomplish in this picture, the flesh, according to the flesh, is trying to accomplish the plan of God through human efforts. That's what Sarah was trying to do, is trying to accomplish, and Abraham was trying to accomplish the plan of God through human efforts. That is not what God had said he was going to do, but they decided to try to help God along. Didn't work. One was according through promise, and this was the child Sarah was able to conceive long after women are able to bear children. Sarah got pregnant. One was through promise, and that is God accomplishing God's plan through, an act of God. Okay? So one is through human efforts, and one is through an act of God. One is through the flesh, and one is through the promise. And so this is what we have so far, okay? Is Abraham, so Paul is setting up this scenario, okay? One is the line of Hagar, and this is flesh. One is the line of Sarah, which is promise. This is not saying in any way that Sarah is better than Hagar or Hagar is better than Sarah. And we'll see that he's just trying to create a picture. One set of choices through the flesh, one set of choices through promise. Okay? Now we start getting into the little more crazy and I think really fun parts, okay? All right, now look at verse 24. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. Lovely, okay? So an allegory is a narrative that is used to creatively teach an idea or a lesson. So I'm going to give you an example. This morning, I stepped on some Legos. At times, Legos can be really fun. But when you step on a Lego, it feels like your foot is falling off. This is like life. Sometimes life can be a lot of fun, but also life can feel like it's trying to slowly chop off your leg. It's an allegory. I used Legos and stepping on them as a small picture of what life is like, okay? That is an allegory. So now Paul is saying, okay, so I have these scenarios and these two ladies, which is what he said there and here. This is, this is what has played out. Now, why this is important is Paul is not replacing the historical context of what has gone on in the book of Genesis. He isn't reframing or rechanging what has gone on from a historical perspective. What he's doing is he's grabbing this account and what plays out and using it to highlight and explain where Paul is now. Okay? And so what this can be defined as is a biblical type, okay? And a type in the Bible is an image, story, or a person that is a smaller version of something greater. For example, Jonah. Jonah was eaten by a fish, and he was in the belly of a whale, okay, for 3 days before he was spit back out. Jonah is a type of what happened with Jesus. Jesus was in the ground, in the belly of the earth for 3 days before he was spit up. It is a smaller version of something that is bigger. And there's lots of times in the Old Testament where it's a small microcosm of something that is bigger. Okay, and we've used that when we refer to the law at times, and Isaac getting sacrificed. There's a lot of types that are small things that sort of picture. So what Paul is doing here by using an allegory is he is using this historical account that happened in Genesis, and he is showing how this allegory is a type of something bigger and better. Okay. So he's not changing anything. He's saying, look how this plays out, and look how this becomes and means something even bigger today. So he's using this story to create and illustrate something bigger. Okay? Hope you're tracking with me so far. All right, so we're back to this thing. So, all right, so now he says, now this may be interpreted allegorically, covered that. All right. Whew. These women, verse 24, are two covenants. Okay? These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, so bearing children for slavery. Okay? One is a covenant of slavery. She is Hagar, and that's why I put under this line, okay? So Hagar, according to the flesh, is a covenant of slavery. Now, which covenant are we talking about? And by referencing Mount Sinai in verse 24, and we'll see verse 25, it is in reference to the Mosaic covenant, this legal covenant that was made. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is where they received the law in Arabia. Now, this is funny. We're not going to get too deep on this, but for those who like it, in your guys' maps, if you want to pause it, most of the time they will show that Mount Sinai is actually located in the Sinai Peninsula right there next to Egypt, okay? Probably not the case, because that peninsula has always been identified as a part of Egypt. So Paul saying in Arabia actually shows that Mount Sinai is actually quite possibly in what we would have now as Saudi Arabia. So you can pause it, go look at your map real quick and see, but that's just a fun little side note of where Mount Sinai probably was according to the Bible, okay? So this Mount Sinai, okay, is according to, she corresponds to present Jerusalem. All right, and present Jerusalem is local Jerusalem, capital of, the nation of Israel, where the temple resides, home of Judaism, that whole thing. That is what Paul is referring to, present Jerusalem here. And for she is in slavery with her children, which is Judaism and that belief system as a whole. This is so far what Paul has presented here, okay? So then, look at what he says in verse 26. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. So, Now, this is what I'm saying here. He doesn't refer to a mountain, but by referring to heavenly Jerusalem, I am actually doing the comparison instead of Mount Sinai, but this is the mountain of God. Okay? Heavenly Jerusalem, the Mount of God, is not slavery, but freedom. So the line of Sarah is attached to heavenly Jerusalem versus present local Jerusalem. And above, in reference to the mountain of God or in the heavens, so the Mount of God, is the line of promise, okay? Promises freedom. So you see how Paul is now setting a comparison. And when we start looking at it like this, we can actually start tracking Paul's argument a whole lot easier, and this begins to make a lot more sense, in my mind, all right? For the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. In comparison, Judaism is stuck in slavery because they're still binding themselves to the law that Jesus has freed them from. In essence, heavenly Jerusalem, by the Mount of God that promises freedom, is all in Jesus. This is Christianity. Jews and Gentiles, through Jesus, are made free from slavery. And this is so far how far Paul is going to highlight this and explain this. He is saying, I am not of them, but I am here. I am of a heavenly Jerusalem. I am free. I am of the mountain of God. Versus the Jews now and these false teachers who are trying to get you to follow and to be trapped back into slavery. Okay? All right, so then he says there in verse 27, okay? He says, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Here he quotes from Isaiah chapter 54, verses 1 through 4. And it's a fascinating quote because he's now referencing barren versus unbarren, and Isaiah is more or less talking to the nation of Israel and how she was barren and going forth. But any reference of thinking barren and having children, one would go back to the account of Sarah being barren and then suddenly being able to bear children. So that's instantaneously this imagery that's Paul is tracking back. But what's fascinating is Paul's using Isaiah 54. And if you go back there and if you look at the chapter before, that's Isaiah 53. And Isaiah 53 is the passage that Isaiah uses to describe a suffering Messiah. And then from this suffering Messiah, that is one day, as he says in Isaiah 53 verse 12, where Isaiah says, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he will divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. This is the Messiah identifying, pouring his soul out, being counted as someone who has sinned. That's where he was bearing the sin of the world on the cross. And yet he bore the sin of many, making intercessions for the transgressors. This is that thing. And then right from here, then in Isaiah 54 talks about how the barren will then give forth and start having more children. Paul is quoting this. He's quoting a messianic idea in connection with the Jews and Gentiles of Christianity being attached to the promised line of Sarah. This is a huge statement here. This is a giant image that he has said. And so here we'll then attach Isaiah 54, 1 through 4 here with this line of why Paul quotes this, okay? All right, let's keep going. Then he says, for you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. Now I'm not going to say yet because my next slide is going to ruin it, but you'll see, okay? Now, you can write children of promise right there, okay? We'll get to that in a sec, all right? But just as, verse 9, But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. Whoa, this is another huge connection that Paul makes, okay? Paul says Isaac of the line of Sarah, Isaac who was born there was born of the Spirit, okay? A supernatural act of God, not through the flesh, not through normal, ordinary means, but through there. And at that time, the children of Hagar, her child, Ishmael, as you can see, I think Genesis 21, Ishmael persecuted or was laughing at her, mocking. We don't know the whole account because it's just a little phrase, but it was so bad that Sarah actually commanded that Ishmael be cast out from the family. And that's why he says in verse 30, but what does Scripture say? Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. There's that quote in Genesis chapter 21. So look at what he has connected here. Not now, Ishmael has been persecuting the child of Sarah, Isaac, and it's just like that going on today. Jews, instead of getting and joining with the line of freedom, are persecuting Christians, and there's a ton of examples of this going on. They even persecuted and rejected Jesus. Okay? Not really good. They're not really on a good streak right now. So here's what's playing out. The comparison is Genesis 21 with Isaiah 54. One, the line of Sarah is this idea of barren and having children. Genesis 21 happens naturally according to the flesh. One is cast out. And if you maintain this imagery, that means Judaism cast out because they refused to accept Jesus, and they're cast out. And then here, line of Sarah, children of promise, and the image there is not just Jews, but Gentiles are part of the line of Sarah. They are heavenly. They are part of the mountain of God. They identify, as Paul says, us, Christians. They are in line of this. They are the children of promise. What an incredible statement for Paul to make here. There is no other way to explain and to try to skirt and try to get around what Paul is saying. Paul is saying that this covenant, the Mosaic covenant, Mount Sinai, the law, is cast out and done. Done with. They are finished. They are living in slavery, living in the flesh. They are a part of a heaven or an earthly city. They are and as a result there, it's the idea that it's cast out. First, Christians today are not living here according to the earth and flesh, but they are the people of promise. They have been promised freedom. They are committed to the mountain of God, a heavenly Jerusalem. They are, as the image there, it's really cool, but this promise of Israel bearing many children, what Israel does is whether spiritual Israel, I guess, the people, have been bearing spiritual children as revealed in the church, spiritual Jews and Gentiles through Christ. A barren nation has been bearing children. It's really cool, and it's just going to keep going. It's just really fascinating imagery that Paul is playing around here with, okay? And so we are, as Gentiles through Christ, the children of promise in the line of Sarah. This is the allegory that Paul presents here. And these are a couple of woe statements that would have happened here, okay? So, if you look at this, what he says there in verse, Okay, one from Mount Sinai bearing children. Okay, look at verse 24. This is the big pow statement here where you can't get around. So he's already attached Hagar to flesh, fleshly living. All right, nah, that's not good, okay? Everyone knows that living in sin, living in flesh, okay, etc. Not good. Then he goes and he drops Mount Sinai, the holy mountain of God, where Israel received the law, the 10 Commandments, okay? In the same sentence as slavery and Hagar. Hagar wasn't looked so kindly upon. It was all about Sarah, all about Sarah. Sarah's the line. It was from Sarah we got Isaac and then Jacob and then the 12 tribes. And that is where it goes. It's all about, and Paul's like, let's make no mistake. You who are still trying to force us to live under the law, under this old system, you're actually a part of the line of Hagar. That's the first pow right there. The other fascinating connection that we touched on is her children being cast out. This is another, can you say that? The one that we talked about before was her children, Judaism, actually attacking the promised children. Whoa! You can't get around this. Paul is not holding back here. Under no circumstances is Paul encouraging or allowing or supporting Christians living in an enslaved system of the law that God has cast away. So that leaves us with some choices. That leaves us with a couple of thoughts. So we are in our church. We have people who have just been saved, people who have been saved, 3 times longer than I've been born. We have this broad swath of people, and I grew up in a culture that, whether they acknowledged it or not, claimed to be a part of the line of Sarah. Yet in practice, in a legalistic practice and lived like the line of Hagar. Okay, and you've heard me explain this many different times, where there's just this guilt and shame being placed upon, and it's very common in conservative Christianity blocks. Okay. And some stuff happened in my mind, and as I was learning about this, and that was a huge paradigm shift in my own life, and I wanted to share some of the questions, some of the thoughts that I worked with, just to help you think through, have I inadvertently been living here when I should be living here? Okay, so I wanted to share, just some of the questions there, because after this week, we're going to be referencing this, but Paul goes a lot more applicational and how this plays out. So it's good to have this sort of thought through before we start getting into this application, okay? So the paradigm shift, here's one of the big ones, okay, that I started to consider and wake my mind up to. This first one is, do your life verses exist in the Old Testament or the New Testament? Now, why is that a big deal? Because there's a lot of verses in the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament, as Paul has put, the Old Testament is the Old Covenant. It is the story of God's covenant relationship with the people of Abraham. The biological people of Abraham, the nation of Israel. All the way back in Genesis, all the way through, it is about God's covenant. It is, in so much of that book of the Old Testament, is through the lens of the law that God gave to the nation of Israel. Okay? And quite often, a lot of times, the verses that are referenced there, if my people call by my name, that one. One of my favorite verses was Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. And so I was there, but something happened as I was beginning to look at this. If most of your verses are in the Old Testament, that means most of your life verses and what you're connecting to your life are written from an old paradigm, an old way of thinking. And so have you inadvertently trapped yourself in Old Testament when you should be using the New Testament now to transform and live your life? And you know, there's a lot of connections that the New Testament quotes the Old Testament and things like that. But it's just one of these shifts in your head. Do you have more verses memorized in the Old Testament than the New? Do you find yourself quoting the Old Testament more than the New Testament? When you try to answer people questions about the Bible, do you go into the Old Testament or do you go into the New Testament? And if we exist more in the New Testament, then that's probably a good, might be evidence that you might be living in the line of Sarah, this idea of children of promise in grace, than in a law system. So that was one question that I had to wrestle around with, myself. Okay? This one here is probably the funniest thing that I never even realized, and it's this question here, is do you feel like you have to clarify what God's grace allows you to do? I had a friend ask me that. He's like, well, how do you like, if grace is so free and you're so free to live in whatever way you want to, I said, yeah, if I as a Christian am not living and don't believe in such a way where I can confidently say that I as a Christian could do whatever I wanted to do, and because of Jesus I would still go to heaven, then I am living in the law and not in grace. And some of us are like, but can't you, and it makes us feel sort of weird. We feel like we have to clarify that. Yeah, but that doesn't mean we can do anything we want to. And if I'm not living in that zone where I have to clarify how free we are, then I'm probably not living in grace, I'm living in law. And anyone would say, hey, living in grace, we'll see next week, living in grace does not mean go and do what you want to whenever you want to and have fun doing it. Yay! Be evil, wicked sinners as saved. No. But if you cannot say what I first said, is that you are free to do whatever you want to. You are so free. Then you probably are doing the more works I do, the more blessed by God. You are living according to the flesh. And this was a really, really, really hard adjustment for my mind to make. And I was comforted by the fact that Paul, in Romans, and you can read there in Romans 6, shall I continue in sin that grace may abound? That's the question. Shall I just continue to do whatever I want to do? See, Paul had taught freedom so much so that people's natural response is, wait, does that mean I can do anything I want to? And Paul's like, okay, he had to clarify. So that's a good question to ask, is which paradigm are you existing in? And then this was another one that was one that I think I've noticed more or less recently in how I've been trying to share the gospel and interact with people. When I try and explain the gospel, do I use freedom to describe it? Or am I using like fear or hardship or you'll get saved from your sins? And do I emphasize sort of there's sort of responsibility after. And it's this is another small one. Like I said, some of these can be broken down, but it's a question. When I describe the gospel, do I describe it, hey, when you're saved, what the gospel does is the gospel frees you from how you're living your life now. Yeah, but as an unsaved person, I can drink, go to parties, I can do whatever I want to do. And it's like, yes, sort of. You can only do what your sinful self wants you to do. You are actually trapped in sin. The gospel frees you. And it's what Paul has used in his terminology now. It frees you from this moral obligation of obeying a higher power, saying God has done all the work for you. You are now free. You are now free to live. You are now free to love. You are now free from slavery. And that's what Paul gets to when he says in verse of chapter 5, verse 1, for freedom Christ has set us free. And he says in verse 31, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. And as we talk about next week, what that gets us to do is, and challenges us, we must stand firm in our freedom and never, ever, ever fall back into the yoke of slavery and bondage that's there in the Old Testament. Something to think about here, this week. Hope you have a wonderful time. I am really excited to get into our study next week. It's like the passage I've been wanting to talk about forever. And so it'll be really fun, but we've gotten it set up. Have a great week. Hopefully I'll see you here soon.